to bridge to the project, our discussion, the presentation of the project itself, the design and some results. I would again emphasize the fact that we have a handout which will be very helpful reading beside the presentations. So we will be picking up on a couple arguments to begin with from the presentation that Daniela just made, by just asking some simple questions in light of the presentation, the broad brush presentation we received about Schumpeterian economics and its relationship to the history of ideas in economics. So the question of what role that innovation plays is a starting point, and we should note here that the traditional way to think about innovation is in terms of performance, in terms of growth of the economy or the performance of the firm. What is often overlooked is this question of resilience, the question that when crises arise or other unexpected events take place, that there's a certain resource, a certain value in conducting and accumulating technology over time, and there is at that point also opportunities that may emerge. And this is the question of survival and recovery that we're focused on in the project. So the effects that socio-economic crises have on innovations themselves can be thought about at the two levels. The one at the micro level, where we were talking about some firms earlier. There's faced by the question of whether to innovate, how to innovate in this context, the context especially of crisis. And we see that the firm is beset by operational constraints. They have the question of financial supply. There's a question of the external climate, what's happening with their intermediate goods, or do they, especially in terms of crisis. This might ring a bell for some of us here. There's also the uncertain outlook. There's a question of the financial conditions that are changing, that are unknown on the 13th of March when you shut down your economy. The demand conditions are known, are in question anyway. And there's the question which Daniela ended on, what would be the future direction of technological change. So that's the question if you think about thinking about innovation at the level of the firm. In addition, and so if you look at the level of the economy or the macro level, the question is then who innovates at what rate, in which direction, when crises take place, and afterwards. We were therefore looking at the changes in patterns of innovation, that is the reactions that might be actually different between the incumbents or the technological accumulators and the creative disruptors, or in other relationships of entrants and incumbents. It's not an exact match between the two, but let's just take that as read. In addition, there's the fact that we ended on as well, the potential for the long-term effect of in terms of the composition of the innovating firms. The last points of Daniela's presentation. And there's a massive amount of policy uncertainty that it goes in tandem with the above. Fundamental implications for policy, which I think was raised at the European level in a useful and provocative way at the end. We're in Norway, and we live in a larger world. And the question of how that support will best, during a crisis, in the lead up to the crisis, at different phases of a crisis, basically. And here I want to stop and walk back a little bit, because we talk about crisis as if it's one thing. It's obviously not one thing. There are different types of socioeconomic crises, and we were. Daniela was talking about the endogenous and the exogenous types of shocks. But first and foremost, there are different phases of a crisis, which unfolds in terms of a pre-shock state, which we will see, especially in the ICT bubble, where you have a pre-shock state, which with certain characteristics, then you get some sort of shock, and you have where we are with the COVID-19 pandemic with a post-shock. So a different crisis will differ in terms of the shape of that reaction. The point that was already talked about, the shocks can emerge from within the economy or outside the economic system. That's an important one, noting that the pandemic was largely was an exogenous event, and therefore very difficult to plan for. And then you can ask the question about the effects, and those effects might be initially more of a supply side phenomenon. They might be more of a demand side phenomenon. And in the case of the pandemic, there was a little bit of both, which will affect what types of firms were able to make the adjustments that Daniele was mentioning. And so the recent examples where we look at a little bit is the COVID-19, which is a focus, but it happened during the project. And there's a financial crisis. We walk back a little bit. And we'll try to look back in time at the ICT bubble as well. So I'm just going to present a follow-up from the question of what the firm does in the context of a crisis. What sort of mechanisms might be there to adjust what the firm does, and we start by with Nelson and Winter's idea, thinking about how the firm works. Daniele was talking about this, but I just want to call your attention to innovation as a deviation from routine, where that routine is a planned event, or is it an unplanned change? It's never completely planned, obviously, but there is a degree of planning or a degree of surprise here, which is notable under crisis to bring forward. And the paper which Daniele was talking about is one of the inspirations for this, for looking at this question during the pandemic, because they were, as the paper with Marian and Filippetti looked at, using the data he was just talking about the fact that in aggregate you will expect things to fall, but not across the board. There'll be different reactions, and the question then is raised about these two types of firms that we were talking about just now, a reduction among the incumbents or an increase among younger dynamic firms. And that has consequences. Which types of firms, in which settings, in which circumstances are affected during a crisis, because as we know, things are not even. And so it may lead to, as we were just talking with the German, or the different examples of a more move from a creative accumulation setup, which would be more steady state from the policy perspective, perhaps to a question, to a reorientation, a rebalancing, as we were just hearing about, towards other smaller firms that are in the creative destruction quadrant of the so highly dynamic entrants, who then can become Bezos tomorrow and can challenge the hierarchy of innovators. So those are some of the basics, and they have implications for public policy to adapt to rebalance, for example, support. And during the COVID-19 in Norway, there were comprehensive support measures that were introduced to help all firms weather the storm. but there may be other ways to adapt public policy instruments in the face of these crises. These are these questions that are in the back or are front and center for the project, which we have spent some time looking at. But we do so on the last point that Daniela was talking about is like the question of lenses. Empirical lenses are incredibly important to adapt and adjust and not be able just to look backwards in time or not just to look in one country. So the question then is how to take stock of the innovating, of firms that are innovating and how that changes under time, under crises. There's a question then about the data, which we spent some time with Statistics Norway and NIFU spent some time looking into. So how to account and control for important factors at the firm level. So there's a need for this granular firm size data, which we'll come back to, over extended periods of time, a point in the Arjibudi Filippetti Friends paper. And there's a need for responsive indicators of the innovation. So how to measure resulting shifts in innovative performance. We'll come to how we do that in this part of the presentation. And then that raises then new questions about how to calculate the significance of those shifts. So how to interpret the patent data that they're now casting with the use of European or international patents. So the question of the empirical lens is the one where we focused our constructive contribution to both the policy, public policy community, who are trying to understand where they are, how to strike a new balance, but also the individuals in the business community. There are two types of analyses that we try to focus on. The first is the retrospective, which is what we usually do, right? We want to look back in time, explain what happened yesterday. And there we will talk about what sort of strategy we pursued very quickly before we look at the results, which is what you probably are more interested in. I'm more interested in laying out the approach, because I think that is also an important contribution of the project. In addition to the retrospective view, which is important to get an idea of the granularity of the different types of populations that are affected in different circumstances at different phases, there's a question of the co-current, so as timely data as possible that is robust at the same time. And that is, of course, necessary when you find yourself at the end of it, March in 2020, and the economy's, and you're looking at the 2018 data. Just to give you a simplified example, that will not help you very much. So there are possibilities to exploit that we should be thinking about in this setting, following in a later phase of the pandemic, after we have weathered to a great degree its consequences and can now start looking retrospectively. But we can't do that in the next crisis, so that's another reason to think about this. So we have that dual aim, and we have the twin requirement that to take stock of the range of different innovators now, which is something that Arjibudi was talking about to begin with. It's important to understand that all innovators are not the same. It's a very heterogeneous bunch. And there is then this need for better, in terms of time, more timely, more highly granular, more robust, to study how these different types respond under crisis. So that's basically the strategy, the approach that we're using. And now I'm going to bore you a little bit with the data integration question, like what sort of data, what you use, but I'm not going to go into great detail for this audience. It's in the handout, but we will, because we want to go into look at the results. basically, we use three ingredients: core data, which is Statistics Norway data, comprehensive, linkable firm data with characteristics that don't move very fast, like location or industry or as well as firm characteristics that do move quite fast, like size, number of employees, the capital, the turnover, etc., that we want to track over time. There's also the question of employees, the skills of the people working in the firms, and these characteristics are captured in these lead data, which are housed and collected and adapted by Statistics Norway. We will also use, so that's the core data around the firm. These are connected then to a set of innovation metrics, which we use the conventional, the Community Innovation Survey, for example, which is the example we were looking at here, but also patents are a conventional proxy for innovation activity. Exit and entry, bankruptcy data is also a characteristic, but not often, less often used metric of industrial dynamics, obviously. And it's used all the time in industrial dynamics, but it's if you think of innovation, anyway. So we use those things with more exploratory data sources. We're talking about the compensation scheme that I was mentioning earlier, R&D support, virkemiddel register data, but also things like trademarks. Trademarks, which we'll get back to at the end of the presentation, are very, very sensitive to changes in the economic environment. So the conventional versus the exploratory are the one way to think of the data we're putting together, and the other is low frequency and high frequency, where low frequency, the CIS, for example, biennial, but very reliable, and it reports what the firms say they did, quite important. But it lags events often, but except apart from this case. In addition, there's the high frequency things. So readings every month or every day, as the case of trademark data. You can watch what happens if you take into account some of the major things that are making those changes that have nothing to do with what you're using the lens for. In addition to those types of empirical approaches or those data sources, we also wanted to talk with people to, as in the case where we're today and the session afterwards, in conversation, workshops with the business community and the public policy communities. So I'm going to just go further, just make two more points before or 3 points, before we go into the results, which will be presented by Statistics Norway, Erik Fjarli, NIFU, Mikael Mark, and then myself. But just before that, I would like to emphasize that we had a main approach and we had an exploratory approach. So the main approach consists of the following. The data we were just talking about, where we categorize the activities of the innovators in the fine-grained taxonomy, which was mentioned, and I will illustrate very briefly. And then that was used, that fine-grained understanding of the different types of innovation that can be affected during a crisis or in the face of the crisis at the different phases, is then applied to the CIS Innovation Survey 2020. That's a main part of the project. Marina, unfortunately, is not here, but she was in charge of that. The interesting thing about the CIS 2020 had direct questions about the pandemic's effect. It also showed that a statistical organization could make itself innovate under a crisis and make adjustments to how it worked in order to provide better information through its statistics. So we capitalized on that combination. In addition, the second part of that was to use higher frequency data. And there we are, again, Marina and Mikael, who will present a little bit more about this, how firms use the public supports schemes to understand also the dynamics that differentiate between different types of firms. That's an important effect that we will look at in light of the compensation schemes that were introduced as a type of natural experiment. And the final bit here is that the exploratory approaches utilized conventional data types, for example, entry and exit. Every day you can, these should be registered patents. Every day you have a registration. These are conventional things that have their own conditionalities, but they are they lag more than they should. But that's another point. But what doesn't lag is trademarks, which is something I would like. I've been working with, and I will present on a little bit later. So we pilot basically a couple of these approaches, and with exit data bankruptcies with Eric Fairley will present, and the firm-linked curated IPR, which I will be presenting. And in the middle, in the first part, we will talk. Mika and Mark from NIFU will be presenting this taxonomy, which is we were talking about. It divided the types of innovators into more than 10 types, following Keith Pavitt's work, which was mentioned earlier. But we can already see just from the long view that there are differences between the types of firms in terms of their allocation to size classes, and in terms of the sectoral differences in type, and some of the typologies that Daniele was presenting earlier, and in terms of the market structure that he also called forth in his presentation. So in terms of those types of parameters of the innovators, we see these 11 groups acting quite differently. So then the question is how that then how the different types of firms then react in this scenario, and when the crisis hits.